Good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome to the Kefron E-Invoicing 2025 update. For those of you who don't know Kefron, we specialize in accounts payable, automation, and e-invoicing solutions for organizations of all different shapes and sizes. Today's session is predominantly focused around organizations that operate internationally, hence will be affected by mandatory e-invoicing that's being introduced in Europe, but also further afield. So in terms of what we're going to cover off today, just to make sure you're all in the right place, we're going to talk a little bit about e-invoicing and why it's being introduced. We're going to talk about different e-invoicing terminology. Unfortunately, there's a lot to digest and undertake, but we'll try and get through that. We'll talk about the different e-invoicing country mandates, and I'm going to try and give you an overview of how one of the mandates is going to work from a workflow perspective, so you can get an indication of what that looks like. And then I'm going to leave time at the end for a little bit of Q&A. So hopefully that's a good use of everyone's time. Again, as I say, if you do have any questions throughout today's session, go to your control panel, use the questions box, pop them in. Who is in the background will make sure they get through to me, and I will answer them as we go. So let's get into the challenge for governments and why e-invoicing is being introduced. I think the main reason that most people are probably aware of is as a result of the VAT gap. So for those of you who don't know, the VAT gap is effectively what the European Union believe they should collect and what they actually collect each year from sales tax. And they believe that that VAT gap is approximately 93 billion euros every single year. So ultimately, the European Union believe they're being shortchanged in terms of the amount of sales tax that they're collecting for B2B and B2C transactions. As a result of that, there's going to be a number of introductory legislation and mandates that's going to support the rise of e-invoicing across different EU member states, but also across the world internationally as a whole, as more and more countries trying to combat this VAT gap within their own region. So let's take a look at kind of the as-is process today, and then the to-be process. So in terms of the as-is process, as most of you know, tax authorities have typically relied on businesses to report VAT liabilities in arrears on monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly intervals. In the to-be process, what governments are trying to introduce is new regulations to monitor activity in real-time or near real-time basis through the introduction of mandatory e-invoicing and e-reporting. I'm going to come on to how this will work in practice, but that's the kind of major step change. The next as-is process is typically, in most countries, the nose process for businesses to submit directly to the tax authority during a sales or a purchase process. Okay, so again, if you think about the to-be process, governments are introducing these regulations to monitor business and activity in real-time basis. And in the as-is process today, there's no real process for you to be able to submit directly to the tax authority in the country that you operate, particularly during a sales or a purchase process. In the to-be process, moving forward with the introduction of e-invoicing, invoices must be submitted to the tax authority portal for approval by that tax authority. So ultimately what the tax authorities and the governments in each individual member state want to introduce is some form of portal for you to be able to submit that invoice, whether it's an accounts payable or an accounts receivable invoice, to automatically be approved by the tax authority. Okay, so again, this is all using digital technology, APIs, and different workflows. Finally, there's no mandate or specific format in most countries for submitting documentation to the tax authority. That's all going to change in the to-be process. There will be specific mandated formats. Unfortunately, there won't be PDFs that will be in place for issuing and receiving electronic invoices via tax authority portals. So every tax authority in each EU member state will have a different specific technical specification of the format of information that they want to receive. Now, in most cases, this is an XML file with slight variations depending on the specific tax authority. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. It's not going to be PDF moving forward, which will probably make most people's lives a lot easier in terms of getting set up for e-invoicing. But that's just to give you an indication of the as-is process and then the to-be process moving forward. In terms of some of the terminology, these are things that you'll probably see coming more to the forefront as you explore the world of e-invoicing, the wonderful world of e-invoicing. So CTC is ultimately responsible for the mandatory transactions of approving these invoices. Okay, so you can think of them almost like the big brother, which ultimately means continuous transaction control. And this is the ultimate in the tax authority control in terms of making sure that instead of sending VAT returns on a quarterly or biannual or annual basis, those invoices must be submitted to the tax authority in real time or near real time basis. So there's two types of e-invoicing that are relatively prominent in most mandates. So one is CTC clearance, and CTC clearance just means that the tax authority must approve the invoice. Okay, so they must be approved using a digital stamp or a signature before it can be sent to the buyer or vice versa to the supplier, depending on the mandate. Reporting is a little bit different. So CTC reporting means invoices don't need pre-approval, okay, but the invoices need to be reported in real time or near real-time basis, right? So typically after a fixed period from 1 to 2 days. So if you've got a clearance mandate, the invoice does need to be signed and approved by the tax authority in that country. If you've just got a reporting mandate, they don't need pre-approval, okay, but they do need to be reported to that tax authority in a real-time or a near real-time basis. If you've got both mandates, okay, clearance and reporting, then again, you must abide by that rule in that country. You'll need to have the invoices approved by the tax authority, and you must be able to provide the reporting capability. The term e-invoice is probably not helpful for most of you. I've been in accounts payable software for the last 5 years, and people call it OCR software, they call it accounts payable automation, they call it e-invoicing software. But ultimately, there's lots of different terminology around e-invoices and the format. But when we're talking about an e-invoice relation to e-invoicing, we're talking about the structured data file invoices that the specific tax authority in that country is mandating. Okay, and again, as I say, the tricky part of this is each country is within their rights to have their own specific mandate and format of that document. Again, I'm happy to take any questions on any of these slides as and when they pop through. Just pop those questions in the chat. So let's get into the actual detail of today's session, which is all around e-invoicing and specific country mandates. Okay, so we were going to talk about specific mandates related to Germany, Spain, France, Malaysia, Poland. We're going to talk about a number of different mandates. It would be really useful as part of today's session if you could go into the questions box and just put the country that you're operating in, okay? When it comes up on the slide, or you can do it now, just give us the list of countries that you're operating in. And as part of the follow-up to today's session, I'll give you an indication of when the mandate is upcoming and what the mandate specifically looks like for that country. So as you get a chance, put them in. If you're just in the UK, put in UK. If you're an international organization, try and put in as many countries that you do operate in. In terms of how it works, before we get into the mandate, I thought it may be useful to try and replicate this in a workflow. So most of you will be able to get an indication of what the workflow can look like when we talk about e-invoicing. So if we take a standard accounts payable process, and we talk about supplier generating an e-invoice, okay? So in this instance, the supplier is going to generate an e-invoice, and again, it's going to be in a specific format. It's going to go for clearance by the tax authority, so that invoice will be issued to the tax authority portal, okay? And again, it's going to go for clearance, hence the terminology around CTC clearance. The tax authority here, okay, are going to assign a unique identifier. So it's almost like a traffic light system. Green, you're approved. Amber, we need more information. Red, we've got an issue, or it's rejected. In terms of where my business and our tool comes into the process, once the e-invoice goes to the tax authority for approval, Kefron is going to pull that information from the tax authority via an API. So for those of you who don't know anything about the Kefron solution, predominantly we started in traditional document processing and AP automation, which was predominantly working with paper documents as well as PDF documents to extract information, put them through a workflow, and get them into our customer's ERP system. With the rise of e-invoicing, now what we're trying to do is pull the information on behalf of our customers from the tax authority in that country through our API, consume that information and provide a representation of the document or e-invoice in the system, and then allow our customers to use that solution as they would if it was a standard PDF document. In this instance, and this is related to the Polish mandate to give you an idea, once the Kefron solution pulls the information from the tax authority, so the e-invoicing information, we're going to send in a confirmation receipt, okay, back to the supplier, okay. We're then going to make that information readily available, right, for the buyer, so into their ERP system, for example, so it's retrievable or downloadable, and then there'll also be a notification sent to that buyer, okay. Obviously, as we've said down here, the e-invoicing format, right, varies depending on the type of country. Okay, so this is just one aspect for a specific country, high level how that could work. And I'm using the Polish mandate example based on what we know so far today as to how that will look. For the countries that we have got live and operational using the solution, it's very, very similar. So again, India, for example, Italy, Malaysia, those types of countries have had mandatory e-invoicing for B2B transactions for a while now. So our customers operating in those locations will have a similar setup to the workflow that you can see on screen. Hopefully that gives you an indication of how e-invoicing works from a high level perspective. We're now going to get into the requirements overview of mandatory B2B invoicing for different countries. Okay, so what I want to cover off is who does it affect? I want to talk about what, okay, so the scope, and I want to talk about how. That's first of all what we're going to cover. In each mandate, we're also going to cover the key requirements. I am going to go through this relatively quickly on each mandate because the specifics are probably for here and now, specifically related to who, what, how, and then the specifics around the timeline, right? So you can get ready in terms of what you need to do ahead of that mandate being mandatory. So if we look at the German mandate, we get an indication of who does this affect. Okay, well, who does it affect? It affects resident taxpayer companies, okay, so companies operating obviously in Germany. The scope of the mandate is B2B, okay, so it's outbound and inbound, right? So not mandatory as B2G or B2C. In terms of the mandate type, we've got clearance and reporting. So the tax authority must approve the invoice, and you must be able to report on those liabilities in a real-time or a near real-time basis. In terms of the network, it's a centralized model. A centralized model effectively means that there's one central platform that facilitates the process, okay? So in the German instance, the tax authority will be responsible for that centralized model or that centralized tax authority portal where the invoices need to be effectively sent, approved, and digitally stamped. In a decentralized model, this involves peer-to-peer transactions, so directly sending e-invoicing formats between suppliers and buyers. But it also involves third-party applications, for example, payable. Okay, so a specific format that's being used in a lot of B2G transactions across different EU member states to support the mandatory B2B e-invoicing aspect. So again, the centralized model is very focused on one platform, typically managed by the tax authority in that country. And then a decentralized is third-party applications and different applications to support the e-invoicing process, like payable. In terms of key requirements, we'll go through this relatively quickly, as I said, right? But there's specific formats. Other formats can be used with buyer's consent until there's a mandatory rollout. So legal mapping is all about the type of format, and each country is going to give you its own syntax. Okay, so for example, in Germany, there's two formats that are mandated. Okay, and that's the, excuse my German for any of the German attendees, the Zugford and the Extragul. And they're specific formats that the German government have issued, which will be the e-invoicing format that must be able to be sent and received by German taxpayers for outbound and inbound B2B transactions. The authenticity relates to how the information is accepted. Okay, so again, in terms of accepting the information, it could be a QR code, it could be an electronic signature. Okay, the validation can be mandatory or it can be outsourced. So actually validating that the information exists on the document connecting to the tax authority, again, can be outsourced to different providers, for example, like Kefron. The transmission, okay, between the buyer and the tax authority and the supplier, again, not regulated, so you can use an AP solution, an AOR solution to support that process. Legibility, okay, so it needs to be in a machine readable format, okay. So again, it needs to be in an XML file typically in most instances. The Zugford and the Exrakung are both XML files, okay. The Kefron solution will convert those XML files to human readable PDFs so you can view them in the system, okay. And then from an archiving perspective, 10 years from the end of the calendar year in which the booking was made, okay. And again, outsourcing allowed. Storage outside of the EU. So if you're working with a vendor that stores their data in the US, for example, that's prior approval to the tax authority. So TEA is related to the tax authority. In terms of the timeline, so if we think about here where we are now, January 2025, the German government have introduced what I like to call a light mandate, which ultimately means they're introducing B2B e-invoicing, okay, but they're effectively making it optional in a lot of respect. So all suppliers may opt to issue structured e-invoices complying with the Exrakung and the Zugford, okay, without the buyer's consent. All buyers from January 2025 is mandatory receipts, okay? So buyers must be able to receive structured e-invoices, okay? And non-CEN compliant e-invoicing allowed if it's agreed between both parties, so the supplier and the buyer. So this is the kind of terminology that's a little bit gray, but it's effectively allowing you, as long as it's mutually agreed, to determine the format of the invoice that you'd like to send. So if that's a PDF in that case, then that's fine. By January 2027, businesses with an annual turnover of 800 must issue e-invoices complying with that specific format, okay? Other businesses that are under that threshold of 800K, right, must send and receive e-invoices if it's agreed between the parties. And then by January 2028, mandatory issuance of structured e-invoices, okay, so for all businesses. Okay, so you can see in this instance, you can see they started with it, all suppliers, all buyers, and made it relatively clear. There's a little bit of gray in terms of you can mutually agree between your buyer and supplier to not send e-invoices. By January 2027, businesses with over 800K, mandatory, and then 2028, again, all businesses. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of the kind of approach that most governments and most countries are taking to e-invoicing. In terms of Belgium, again, who does it affect? VAT registered taxpayers established in Belgium, but also foreign non-established VAT registered taxpayers. Similar to Germany, it's B2B, it's outbound and inbound. And similar to Germany, it's clearance, it's reporting, and it's a centralized platform. Okay, they do also allow via payable because payable has been included within B2G transactions within Belgium for quite a while. We'll send you these slides as part of the follow-up because in the interest of time, I'm going to focus specifically on the timeline so you get an indication of the timeline and what you need to do if you're operating in Belgium. So, mandatory B2B e-invoicing, inbound and outbound, will be made mandatory as the default system in January 2026. So again, we've got a little bit of time. It's just CTC clearance for January 2026, and when we move to 2026 to 2030, there may be an e-reporting requirement, okay, or an introduction of e-reporting. So again, it will start with just a clearance model. If we move to Poland, this is a little bit more complex, and the Polish government did postpone their timelines. So I will make this point now. A lot of the countries that we do work with, obviously a mandate gets announced. Our customers want to get ahead of the game in terms of making sure their organization is set up for inbound and outbound B2B transactions. The Polish government introduced mandatory e-invoicing, which was due to be implemented and the deadline for July 2024. They've now, or in the lead up to 2024, July 2024, they've postponed that mandate. I will say now that most of the countries that we've had experience with in terms of getting ready for e-invoicing have postponed that deadline date. Okay, so if you're looking at these timelines and you're getting a little bit concerned, there is a potential for a postponement. Okay, but again, it's better to be safe than sorry. Get the work done ahead of time, in line for the mandate, and if it's pushed, again, you're ready to go. In terms of Poland, VAT registered companies, domestic and foreign, with a Polish business established. There is VAT exempted taxpayers, obviously don't need to be involved. There will be a requirement for B2G, okay? Plans to introduce B2C, but definitely for B2B, it'll be outbound and inbound. It's just a clearance model and it will be centralized, okay? So through the KSEF, which is the tax authority in Poland. And in terms of the timeline, there's a voluntary phase, which was and did come into effect in January 2022. As we talked about, the mandatory legislation was postponed. Okay, so again, similar to Germany, you can opt to send an e-invoice, right, alongside paper and other e-invoice formats. But again, that hasn't been a massive take-up yet. In terms of the mandatory phase, February 2026, okay, e-invoicing via the KSEF, so the tax authority in Poland, will be mandatory for taxpayers whose turnover exceed 200 million or 46 million euros. Okay, in the preceding year. From April 2026, e-invoicing will be mandatory for all other taxpayers. Okay, so if you are operating in Poland, it's a big market for you. Again, February 2026 seems a long time away, but it is important to start engaging the business and different parts of the organization, as well as third parties, to support you on that rollout. France is the big one, okay? It's a big market for most of our customers. There's a lot of detail to cover specifically for France, but in terms of the what and how, for e-invoicing, it'll be B2B domestic sales, okay? They must be invoiced and reported on the fly to the tax administration. The French government have taken a different approach, or an interesting approach, I should say, which has enabled a specific type of dematerialization platform, which is a PDP, which is effectively certified by the French government third parties. And again, through the Kefron relationship with our partners, which is Sovos, we're a PDP approved organization to work with if you are operating in France. So this is just a third party that's approved by the French government to interact with their tax authority. That's the easiest way and best way to explain it. Tax authorities or trading parties must exchange e-invoices statuses and report them to the tax administration. So we talked about that red, amber and green traffic light system. E-reporting will be mandatory. So data related to other transactions, cross-border B2B sales, B2C sales must be reported periodically, okay, through the e-reporting. And then there is a requirement around payments. So the supplier must electronically report received payments for services sold. In terms of the timelines, to give you an indication, e-invoicing is going to be mandatory September 2026, okay, for enterprises over 5,000 employees, okay, and with a revenue of over 50 million, September 2026, sorry, 150 million, I should say. And for large organizations, okay, so for less than 5,000 employees, September 26, I should say. For mid-sized organizations, so if you're less than 250 employees and 50 million in revenue, or if you're very small, so less than 10 employees and 2 million in revenue, it'll be September 1st, 2027. So most businesses are getting ready for the September 1st, 2026 deadline. Other customers in this mid-size and small range have 2027 in mind. My advice would be to the mid-size or very small organizations, again, try and get ahead of the game. You probably don't need to worry about this until 2026, but I would start early in 2026. For organizations that are in the enterprise or the large size companies, and this again is 4 million French companies, so we've got about 8,300 that this will affect from September 1st, 2026. Very important to start engaging with your organization, with third parties, with the tax authority, with your tax advisors, to effectively get set up to support the France mandate. I will say the France mandate looks a little bit more complex than the other mandates that I have seen, just in terms of the amount of information that's being required. However, the fact that they are allowing and have certified specific third-party providers to support will make that jump a lot easier for most businesses. To finish on Spain and Malaysia before I take a couple of questions, which I promised to do, really quickly on Spain, there's no formal mandate in place. They did plan to launch B2B invoicing in 2024, similar to Poland. They postponed it. There's an expected launch date in 2025 for the mandate. It will be a phased approach, okay, and it will initially affect large taxpayers, with all other large taxpayers later in the year. Really important, there's no mandate in place. There will be a launch date expected in 2025, which we expect to be later in 2026. It'll affect B2B invoicing. It'll be a phased approach, and it's going to affect those large taxpayers first and foremost. From August 2024, if you are operating in e-invoicing in Malaysia, there is a mandatory e-invoicing legislation in Malaysia, okay, with an annual turnover of more than 21 million euro. We do have customers live in Malaysia. I haven't spent loads of time on this just in the interest of time and the people that were registering for today's session. Okay, but if you are operating in Malaysia, you don't have an e-invoicing solution set up, you do need to speak to a third party. So I'd be happy to speak to you directly or speak to your ERP team to see what they can do to support that requirement. I'm going to leave my contact details on the screen for any of you to reach out to me directly. My email address is jamesk@kefron.com. I appreciate that was a lot of information to cover. I rushed through specific sets of it to try and get through all of the different countries that we think you need to be thinking about. But hopefully that was useful to give you an indication of some of the upcoming mandates.